Hello, nursing fans. Today we are doing Anatomy, Chapter 14, which is the heart. And this is the second edition of Gale Sloan Thompson, Understanding Anatomy. So in my book, it starts on page 274. Key structures of the heart include the pericardium, the heart wall, the chambers, and the valves. Oh, actually, I'm reading, it actually starts on page 273, so let me read that. The human heart beats about 100,000 times in one day and about 35 million times in a year. During an average lifetime, the human heart will beat more than 2.5 billion times. The heart could be called the engine of life. This incredibly powerful organ works constantly, never pausing and never resting. My book doesn't say that, but that's my opinion, and that's important here. Composed of a type of muscle found nowhere else in the body, the heart works to pump blood throughout the body, delivering oxygen-rich blood to the organs and tissues and returning oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. About the size of a fist, the heart lies in the thoracic cavity in the mediastinum, a space between the lungs and beneath the sternum. The heart tilts toward the left so that 2/3 of it extends to the left of the body's midline. The broadest part of the heart, called the base, is at the upper right, while the pointed end, called the apex, is at the lower left. Fast fact: the study of the heart and the treatment of related disorders is called cardiology. Key structures of the heart include the pericardium, the heart wall, the chambers, and the valves. The pericardium. Surrounding the heart is a double-walled sac called the pericardium, anchored by ligaments and tissue to surrounding structures. The pericardium has two layers, the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium, a loose-fitting sac of strong connective tissue, is the outermost layer, and the serous pericardium, which consists of two layers, covers the heart's surface. At the heart's base, the serous pericardium folds back onto itself to form the parietal layer and the visceral layer. The parietal layer, which lines the inside of the fibrous pericardium, and the visceral layer, which covers the heart's surface. Between these two layers is the pericardial cavity. This cavity contains a small amount of serous fluid, which helps prevent friction as the heart beats. So there's a similar setup in the lungs because the lungs need to move a lot, and the two surfaces rubbing together could cause a lot of friction. So serous fluid is in between them, a very small amount. It's really slippery and it makes everything move easily without causing pain when things are working properly. The heart wall consists of three layers. The endocardium lines the heart's chambers, covers the valves, and continues into the vessels, and it consists of a thin layer of squamous epithelial cells. The myocardium, composed of cardiac muscle, forms the middle layer. It's the thickest of the three layers and performs the work of the heart. The epicardium, which consists of a thin layer of squamous epithelial cells, covers the heart's surface, also known as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. The epicardium is loosely integrated with the myocardium. Fast fact: the endocardium is very smooth, an important characteristic that helps keep blood from clotting as it fills the heart's chambers. And in my book, I have an asterisk which says we need to know the layers of the heart, which are shown here: the endocardium, the myocardium, and the epicardium. The heart chambers and great vessels. The heart contains 4 hollow chambers. The 2 upper chambers are called atria. Singular, it's atrium. The 2 lower chambers are called ventricles. Attached to the heart are several large vessels that transport blood to and from the heart. Called great vessels, they include the superior and inferior vena, pulmonary artery, which branches into the right and left pulmonary artery, 4 pulmonary veins, 2 for each lung, and the aorta. Atria. The atria serve primarily as reservoirs, receiving blood from the body or lungs. The right and left atria are separated by a common wall of myocardium called the interatrial septum. Because the atria move blood only a short distance from the atria to the ventricles, they don't have to generate much force. Consequently, the walls of the atria are not very thick. All the work actually gets done in the ventricles. The ventricles serve as pumps, receiving blood from the atria and then pumping it either to the lungs through the right ventricle or the body, the left ventricle. The right and left ventricles are separated by the interventricular septum. Because the ventricles pump rather than receive blood, they must generate more force than the atria. Therefore, the walls of the ventricles are thicker than those of the atria. Furthermore, because the left ventricle must generate enough force to push blood throughout the entire body rather than just to the lungs, the walls are thicker than those of the right ventricle. Question. The sac surrounding the heart is called the A. epicardium, B. endocardium, C. myocardium, or D. pericardium? And the answer is D. pericardium. And the rationale is that the endocardium, myocardium, and epicardium are 3 layers of the heart wall. So the sac is the pericardium. These others are layers of the heart wall. Okay, I'm on page 276. The heart valves. To ensure that blood moves in a forward direction through the heart contains 4 valves. One between each atrium and its ventricle, and another at the exit of each ventricle. Each valve is formed by 2 or 3 flaps of tissue called cusps or leaflets. The atrioventricular AV valves regulate flow between the atria and the ventricles. The right AV valve, also called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 leaflets, prevents backflow from the right ventricle to the right atrium. So this is basically the one-way valve. So it's only going to let stuff go in one direction. And from the atrium, which is where it all gets stored before it's ready to get pumped. Once that's all filled up, then the valve slips open, everything goes right into the next, which is the ventricle. So the left AV valve is also called the bicuspid valve because it has 2 leaflets, or more commonly, the mitral valve, and it also prevents backflow. But it prevents backflow from the left ventricle to the left atrium because it's supposed to be going one way, right? It's a one-way street there from the atrium, which is the first room that you go in, and then once everything's there and ready to be pumped, it goes into the pump, and that's where the work is done in the ventricles. So the semilunar valves regulate the flow between the ventricles and the great arteries. There are 2 semilunar valves. The pulmonary valve prevents backflow from the pulmonary artery to the right ventricle, and the aortic valve prevents backflow from the aorta to the left ventricle. The heart skeleton. A semi-rigid, fibrous connective tissue called the skeleton of the heart encircles each valve. Besides offering support for the heart, the skeleton keeps the valves from stretching. It also acts as an insulating barrier between the atria and the ventricles, preventing electrical impulses from reaching the ventricles other than through the normal conduction pathway. The body at work. Valves open and close in response to pressure changes within the heart. For example, when a ventricle relaxes, the pressure within that ventricle drops. The AV valve leaflets hang limply, allowing blood to flow through the open valve into the ventricle. As the ventricle fills, pressure in the ventricle rises. After filling, the ventricle begins to contract and the pressure rises even more. This increased pressure pushes against the cusps of the AV valve, causing it to snap closed. When the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure downstream, the semilunar valve pops open, allowing blood to flow into the area of lower pressure. Heart sounds. When the heart valves close, they produce vibrations that can be heard with a stethoscope on the body's surface. Think of a door, which is silent as it opens, but it produces a sound as it closes. By listening in key areas, the sounds made by individual valves can be identified. The illustration here shows the relationship between each valve and the surface area where the sound is heard the loudest. Heart sounds will be discussed in more detail in the section Cardiac Cycle, which appears later in this chapter. So the aortic area is, I don't know if it's really showing it very well here. Let me see if I can zoom in here. Number 1 is the aortic area. And, oops, okay. The book says number 1 is the aortic area, the second intercostal space, right sternal border. And number 2 is the pulmonic area, the second intercostal space, the left sternal border. So this is the sternum here, and you're going to be the valves, it's showing the location of those roughly. So number 3, the fourth or fifth intercostal space and the left sternal border. And 4 would be the mitral area, the fifth intercostal space, the left mid-clavicular line. Life lesson, valvular disease. A heart valve that fails to prevent the backflow of blood during contraction is called incompetent, and the condition is known as valvular insufficiency. Valvular insufficiency allows blood to leak backward or regurgitate into the chamber from which it was just pumped. For example, aortic insufficiency allows blood to leak back into the left ventricle after being pumped into the aorta. As a result, the left ventricle has to work harder, pumping out the blood flowing into it from the left atrium, as well as the blood flowing back into it from the aorta. A stenotic valve is one that has become narrowed, such as from scar tissue. This condition is called valvular stenosis. Stenotic valves also force the heart to work harder, causing it to strain to pump blood through the narrowed opening. The backflow of blood through an incompetent valve or the force of blood moving through a stenotic valve creates turbulence. This turbulence produces an abnormal sound called a heart murmur, which can be heard through a stethoscope. Depending upon the severity of the defect, incompetent and stenotic valves can eventually lead to heart failure. In these instances, the defective valves can be replaced with either artificial valves or valves transplanted from a pig's heart. Pretty major surgery. Actually, they have some valves now that can be done without cutting the chest open. They can be delivered, believe it or not, just through an artery. I'm sure we'll be learning about that pretty soon. Okay, question. What heart valve controls the flow of blood between the left atrium and the left ventricle? Is it the pulmonary valve, the aortic valve, the tricuspid valve, or the mitral valve? The answer is D, the mitral valve, because the pulmonary valve prevents backflow from the pulmonary artery to the right ventricle, and the aortic valve prevents backflow from the aorta into the left ventricle. So the tricuspid valve prevents backflow from the right ventricle into the right atrium, leaving the mitral valve to cover the left ventricle and left atrium. Okay, so let's go now to page 278, blood flow through the heart. No connection exists between the right and left sides of the heart, and the flow of blood through each side is kept separate from each other. So you know what? This is where I think it's important that people understand how the heart is doing two different things at the same time. It's pretty impressive. So this kind of was explaining that these are completely separate areas, and it is doing two different things. One is just trying to get the stuff a short distance, get the blood to the lungs because it needs to be reoxygenated. And the other part of the heart is trying to get the blood to go everywhere else in the body, which is a big job. But they do it independently, yet they do work together. So you can see why it's important to have both parts functioning properly, because otherwise, eventually, one can affect the other. But as nurses, we need to understand exactly which job that the heart is doing is having issues, so that way we can give them the right treatment. The problem is, if there's a problem with the heart, it never rests. So it's very difficult for the heart to heal itself. So these issues are often long-term issues that tend to affect other organs before you know it. And so we treat all of those as nurses. But the main thing is try to make sure that the heart stays as healthy as possible. So I'm on page 278. Even so, the two sides or pumps work together to ensure that the organs and tissues of the body receive an adequate supply of oxygenated blood. So number one, the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood returning from the body through the superior and inferior vena cava. So in this case, the red blood cells are carrying carbon dioxide, and we need to get those blood cells into the lungs so that we can do a gas exchange and give up the carbon dioxide and get oxygen, and then from there go back to the heart to go to the rest of the body. So number one is when the heart, the right atrium, is receiving deoxygenated blood. So they're showing it blue in the picture. Number two, once the right atrium is full, it contracts, and this forces the tricuspid valve open and the blood flows into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle is full, the tricuspid valve snaps closed so that none of the blood is moving backward into the atria. And number three, after filling, the right ventricle contracts, forcing the pulmonary valve open. So remember, that's the valve that's going to the lungs, the pulmonary valve. Blood is pumped into the right and left pulmonary arteries, and into the lungs. So it has to split up because we've got lungs on the right and the left. So it's got to go both directions. So after the right ventricle empties, the pulmonary valve closes to prevent the blood from flowing backward into the ventricle. Oh, that's number 3. There it is. Number 4, after replenishing its supply of oxygen and cleansing itself of carbon dioxide in the lungs, the blood enters the pulmonary veins and returns to the heart through the left atrium. So now, in this case, remember that we're calling these the pulmonary veins. These are the only veins in the body that have oxygen. All the rest of the veins do not. They're deoxygenated because they're returning to the heart. But in this case, it's returning to the heart from the lungs, so it does have oxygen. So this could be tricky. I think that there might be a question on the test about that. Or it's kind of counterintuitive because you generally expect veins not to have oxygen. And they don't unless they are just right there between the lungs and the heart, going to the heart before it gets out to the rest of the body. So let's move on to number 5. When the left atrium is full, it contracts. This forces the mitral or bicuspid valve open and blood is pumped into the left ventricle. And number 6, when the left ventricle is full, the mitral valve closes to prevent backflow. The ventricle then contracts, forcing the aortic valve to open, allowing blood to flow into the aorta. From there, oxygenated blood is distributed to every organ and tissue in the body. Fast fact: although the right and left sides of the heart act as separate pumps, they perform their work simultaneously. Both the right and left atria contract at the same time, as do both ventricles. So it's very much a coordinated team effort there. Coronary circulation on page 280. Just like any other organ or tissue in the body, the heart muscle requires an abundant supply of oxygen and nutrients. Because of its high demands, the heart has its own vascular system, known as the coronary circulation, to keep it well supplied with oxygenated blood. Coronary arteries deliver oxygenated blood to the myocardium, while cardiac veins collect the deoxygenated blood. The 2 main coronary arteries, the right and left, arise from the ascending aorta and serve as the principal routes for supplying blood to the myocardium. So the right coronary artery supplies blood to the right atrium, part of the left atrium, most of the right ventricle, and the inferior part of the left ventricle. And the left coronary artery, which branches into the anterior descending and circumflex arteries, supplies blood to the left atrium, most of the left ventricle, and most of the interventricular septum. Fast fact: the most abundant blood supply goes to the myocardium of the left ventricle, and that's because the left ventricle does most of the work and therefore needs more oxygen and nutrients than the rest of the myocardium. The body at work. Unlike the rest of the body, coronary arteries receive their blood supply when the ventricles relax. That's because myocardial contraction compresses the coronary arteries, restricting blood flow. As the aortic valve opens during contraction, the cusps of the valve cover the openings to the coronary arteries, blocking the flow of blood. When the ventricles relax, the coronary arteries fill with blood needed to nourish the heart muscle. Knowing this, you can see why a sustained elevated heart rate can be harmful? Because if the heart is constantly in tension and working and not relaxing, then blood can't get to the heart itself. So it's so busy working hard to deliver blood to the rest of the body that it's not able to get blood into the veins, even though, hey, they're right there. First thing that gets blood coming out of the heart is the aorta. That's where all the oxygenated blood is. And these arteries come straight out of that. But the problem is when the heart is working, when that muscle is moving, it ends up in all that pressure in the heart is compressing the vessels so that they can't fill with blood. Not until the heart relaxes and there's no tension, then that's what's going to happen. The pressure is going to bring the blood into those arteries, and that will then deliver the oxygen it needs to all the muscle in the heart. The most important, they're saying, or the biggest draw of the oxygen would be the left ventricle, because that part of the heart is trying to get the blood from there to every other point in the body. And you can see why that might be a challenge for some of the most distant tissues, such as your toes and your feet. So it's important that the left ventricle remains strong. And when things start to fail, unfortunately, blood can't get to all the tissues. And so the tissues that are going to be neglected first are those that are most distant, which unfortunately is the feet and the legs, the lower extremities. So page 290, oh, here's a question. Which great vessel supplies blood to the right atrium? Is it the superior and inferior vena cava? Well, probably not, because those are veins. So those do not have oxygen. Those are not going to be a good blood supply for the atrium, which has a lot of work to do to pump. So would it be the aorta? I think it is. I think that's what they said. And the pulmonary artery, we know that that one actually doesn't have oxygen, and the pulmonary veins do have oxygen, but the pulmonary veins are not supplying blood to the right atrium. Actually, you know what? I think it might be A, the vena cava. Let's see, because it's the first. Wait a minute. It is A, the vena cava, right? Because I was thinking of supplying blood to the muscle of the atrium, but actually they meant to the interior of the atrium, which that would be the superior and inferior vena cava, because that is, let me see what their explanation is. So, because the aorta receives blood from the left ventricle, and the pulmonary artery receives blood from the right ventricle. The pulmonary veins are what transport the blood from the lungs to the left atrium. So, yes, the great vessel that supplies blood to the right atrium is the superior and inferior vena cava. Let's see if it shows it on here. There we go, this big blue one. So this is coming from above and this is coming from below. All this blood that doesn't have any oxygen because it's been to the tissues and it's done the exchange, gotten the carbon dioxide, and now it lands here in the right atrium before entering the right ventricle. And then it goes to the lungs. Okay, so let me just find our question. Where was it? Okay, so here we go. Cardiac conduction. Well, I'm still reading. I'm on page 281, so I will read life lesson, angina and myocardial infarction. Coronary artery disease is the leading cause of death in America today, causing almost 500,000 deaths each year. The disease results when the coronary arteries become blocked or narrowed by a buildup of cholesterol and fatty deposits, atherosclerosis. Any interruption in blood supply to the myocardium deprives the blood tissue of oxygen, ischemia, causing pain. Within minutes, cell death, necrosis occurs. Sometimes the interruption is temporary, such as angina pectoris. What happens in this condition is that a partially blocked vessel spasms, or the heart demands more oxygen than the narrowed vessel can supply, such as during a period of peak exertion. When the demand for oxygen exceeds the supply, ischemia and chest pain result. With rest, the heart rate slows down and adequate circulation resumes. Chest pain stops and permanent myocardial damage is avoided. A more serious condition is a myocardial infarction, MI. In this situation, blood flow is completely blocked by a blood clot or fatty deposit, resulting in the death of myocardial cells in the area fed by the artery. Once the cells die, they produce an area of necrosis. Symptoms of an MI or heart attack vary widely, particularly between women and men. Men commonly experience chest pain or pressure, discomfort in the upper body, including either arm, the back, neck, jaw, or stomach, shortness of breath, nausea, profuse sweating, or anxiety. Women are more likely to complain of sudden extreme fatigue, not explained by a lack of sleep, abdominal pain or heartburn, dizziness, or weakness. Most cardiac veins empty into the coronary sinus, a large transverse vein on the heart's posterior, which returns the blood to the right atrium. The exception is the anterior cardiac veins, which empty directly into the right atrium. The body at work. When a blockage occurs gradually, a narrowed coronary artery may develop, quote, collateral circulation, unquote. Collateral circulation is when new blood vessels develop to reroute blood flow around a blockage. Even so, the new arteries may not supply enough blood to the myocardium during times of increased oxygen demand, such as during exertion or stress. The good news, however, is that studies have shown that regular exercise promotes the development of even greater collateral circulation. Fast fact: heart disease kills twice as many women as all cancers combined. In addition, women are more likely to die from their first heart attack than men are. Cardiac conduction, page 282. Cardiac muscle is unique in that it doesn't depend upon stimulation by extrinsic nerves to contract. Rather, it contains a special pacemaker. It contains special pacemaker cells that allow it to contract spontaneously, an ability called automaticity. Also, because the heart beats regularly, it is said to have rhythmicity. Although extrinsic nerves don't cause heart to beat, the nervous system and certain hormones can affect the heart's rate and rhythm. The electrical impulses generated by the heart follow a very specific route through the myocardium, as shown below. There's actually an animation to go along with this. I don't know if I can do it. Let's see.
Cardiac muscle is unique. It depends on stimulation by extrinsic nerves to contract. Instead, it contains pacemaker cells that allow it to contract spontaneously, an ability called automaticity. The electrical impulses generated by the heart follow a very specific route through the myocardium. Normal cardiac impulses arise in the sinoatrial, or SA, node, which is located in the wall of the right atrium just below the opening of the superior vena cava. From there, an interatrial bundle of conducting fibers rapidly conducts the impulses to the left atrium, and both atria begin to contract. The impulse travels along three internodal bundles to the atrioventricular, or AV node. There, it slows considerably to allow the atria time to contract completely and the ventricles to fill with blood. After passing through the AV node, the impulse picks up speed. It then travels down the bundle of His, also called the atrioventricular or AV bundle. The AV bundle soon branches into right and left bundle branches. Purkinje fibers conduct the impulses throughout the muscle of both ventricles, causing them to contract almost simultaneously.
That is so neat. Okay, let's get back to this. And if I can do any more. Oh, look at this. There's even some little notes at the bottom here. I didn't realize that. Okay, well, anyway, I'm going to read the book, which is probably a lot of what they just said. But number one, normal cardiac impulses arise in the SA node from its spot in the wall of the right atrium just below the opening of the superior vena cava. Number two, an interarterial bundle of connecting fibers rapidly conducts the impulses to the left atrium, and both atria begin to contract. Number three, the impulse travels along three internodal bundles to the AV node located near the right AV valve at the lower end of the interatrial septum. There, the impulse slows considerably to allow the atria time to contract completely and the ventricles to fill with blood. The heart's skeleton insulates the ventricles, ensuring that only impulses passing through the AV node can enter. Number four, after passing through the AV node, the impulse picks up speed. It then travels down the bundle of His, also called the AV bundle. The AV bundle soon branches into the right and left branches. Purkinje fibers conduct the impulses throughout the muscle of both ventricles, causing them to contract almost simultaneously. Body at work. The SA node is the heart's primary pacemaker. If the SA node fails to fire, pacemaker cells in the AV node or Purkinje fibers can initiate impulses, although at a slower rate. Pacemakers other than the SA node are called ectopic pacemakers. The heart's pacemakers and their firing rates when the heart is at rest are as follows. The SA node fires at 60 to 80 beats per minute. The AV node has a firing rate of 40 to 60 beats per minute, and the Purkinje fibers have a firing rate of 20 to 40 beats per minute. Fast fact, because the signals triggering the heart's contractions originate within itself, even if the heart is removed from the body, it will continue to beat for hours as long as it's kept in a protected environment. That's pretty wild. Okay, electrocardiogram. Electrocardiogram. Cardiac impulses generate electrical currents in the heart. These currents spread through surrounding tissue and can be detected by electrodes placed on the body's surface. The record of these signals is called an electrocardiogram, ECG. An ECG records the electrical activity or impulses, and it does not record the heart's contractions. An ECG that appears normal is called normal sinus rhythm, meaning that the impulse originates in the SA node. An irregular heartbeat is called an arrhythmia. The P wave represents atrial depolarization, the transmission of electrical impulses from the SA node through the atria. This occurs right before the atria contract. The PR interval represents the time it takes for the cardiac impulse to travel from the atria to the ventricles. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization, the spread of electrical impulses throughout the ventricles. The ST segment represents the end of ventricular depolarization and the beginning of ventricular repolarization. And the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. Life lesson: arrhythmias. Arrhythmias result when part of the conduction pathway is injured or when part of the myocardium other than the SA node, called an ectopic focus, generates a beat. Common cardiac arrhythmias include atrial flutter, premature ventricular contractions, and ventricular fibrillation. Atrial flutter occurs when an ectopic focus in the atria fires rapidly, causing the atria to contract between 200 and 400 times per minute. The AV node blocks impulses in excess of 180 beats per minute, which helps protect the heart from a life-threatening ventricular response. Because proper atrial function isn't as crucial as proper ventricular function, atrial flutter isn't usually life-threatening. Premature ventricular contractions, PVCs, which may occur as a single beat or in bursts of several beats, result from the firing of an ectopic focus in the ventricles. While PVCs may indicate a serious underlying condition, more benign causes of PVCs include lack of sleep, caffeine, or emotional stress. Ventricular fibrillation, on the other hand, is a life-threatening emergency resulting from electrical signals arising from different regions of the myocardium. Fibrillation causes the heart to quiver rather than contract. Since a fibrillating heart can't pump blood, cardiac output plummets and cardiac arrest may quickly follow. Ventricular fibrillation requires immediate defibrillation. In this procedure, a strong electrical jolt is delivered to the heart through a pair of large electrodes, causing the entire myocardium to depolarize. If the first part of the heart to recover from depolarization is the SA node, sinus rhythm can resume. Keep in mind that defibrillation treats only the symptom of fibrillation. It doesn't treat its cause. However, once sinus rhythm is restored, other treatments can be implemented to correct the cause of the arrhythmia. Cardiac cycle. The series of events that occur from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next is called the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle consists of two phases: systole or systole contraction and diastole relaxation. Both atria contract simultaneously. Then, as the atria relax, both ventricles contract. The vibrations produced by the contraction of the heart and the closure of the valves produce the lub-dub heart sounds that can be heard with a stethoscope. The first heart sound, S1, is louder and longer, and the second, S2 sound, is a little softer and sharper. Here's what happens during one heartbeat. And the book says that there's an animation for that too. But I will just read it here. 1. Passive ventricular filling. Returning venous blood has filled the atria, causing their pressure to rise above that in the ventricles. The AV valves open and the blood flows into the ventricles. The P wave appears on the ECG, marking the end of atrial depolarization. Number 2, atrial systole. The AV valves are open and the semilunar valves are closed. The atria contract to eject the remaining volume of blood, and the ventricles are relaxed, filling with blood. 3. Isovolumetric contraction. This is the brief period during which the ventricles are beginning to contract, but the semilunar valves haven't yet opened. Note, the prefix iso means equal, volumetric refers to volume, therefore isovolumetric refers to something having the same or equal volume. The volume of blood in the ventricles remains constant, but the pressure rises rapidly as the ventricles begin to contract. The R wave appears on the ECG. The first heart sound, S1, can be heard. Number 4, ventricular ejection. When the pressure in the ventricles exceeds the pressure in the pulmonary artery and aorta, the semilunar valves open. Blood spurts out of each ventricle, rapidly at first and then more slowly as the pressure drops. The ventricles don't eject all of their blood. The blood remaining in the ventricles at the end of the ejection period is the residual volume. The T wave occurs late in this phase, beginning at the moment of peak ventricular pressure. Isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. This is the period, oh, that's the next slide, number 5. This is the period at the end of ventricular ejection before the AV valves have opened, but after the semilunar valves have closed to prevent blood from re-entering the ventricles. The volume of blood in the ventricles remains unchanged, and the pressure falls dramatically as the ventricles relax. The T wave ends on the ECG, and the second heart sound, S2, can be heard as blood rebounds against the closed semilunar valves. Let's take a look at the animation.
The series of events that occur from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next is called the cardiac cycle. Here's what happens during one cardiac cycle. In the first step of the cardiac cycle, venous blood returns to the heart and fills the atria. As it does, pressure in the atria rises above that in the ventricles. This causes the atrioventricular valves to open and blood flows into the ventricles. This period is called passive ventricular filling. Atrial systole then occurs. In this phase, the atria contract to eject their remaining volume of blood to the relaxed ventricles. At this point, the atrioventricular valves are open and the semilunar valves are closed. Following is isovolumetric contraction, a brief period during which the ventricles are beginning to contract, but the semilunar valves haven't yet opened. The volume of blood in the ventricles remains constant, but the pressure rises rapidly as the ventricles begin to contract. When the pressure in the ventricles exceeds the pressure in the pulmonary artery and aorta, the semilunar valves open and the phase of ventricular ejection begins. The blood spurts out of each ventricle, rapidly at first and then more slowly as the pressure drops. The ventricles don't eject all of their blood. The blood remaining in the ventricles at the end of the ejection period is the residual volume. At the end of ventricular ejection, a brief period occurs during which both the atrioventricular and semilunar valves are closed. Specifically, the semilunar valves have closed to prevent blood from re-entering the ventricles, but the atrioventricular valves have not yet opened. In this phase, called isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, the volume of blood in the ventricles remains unchanged, but the pressure declines dramatically as the ventricles relax.
What is the heart's primary pacemaker? The AV node? No. The Purkinje fibers? I don't think so. The sympathetic nervous system? No. The SA node? Yes. D is the answer. The sinoatrial node. If the sinoatrial node fails, the AV node and the Purkinje fibers can initiate impulses, but they are not the primary pacemakers. The sympathetic nervous system can alter the heart's rate, but it does not act as a pacemaker. Cardiac output. I'm going to read one more thing on page 284. The body at work. The right and left ventricles receive about 70% of their blood passively. It simply flows from the right and left atria after the mitral and tricuspid valves open. Late in the filling process, both atria contract. Known as atrial kick, this contraction supplies the ventricles with the remaining 30% of the blood. In contrast, the ventricles must actively pump all of their blood into the arteries. Knowing this, it becomes clear why properly functioning ventricles are more crucial to survival than properly functioning atria. Cardiac output, CO. Cardiac output refers to the amount of blood that the heart pumps in 1 minute. To determine cardiac output, multiply the heart rate, the number of times the heart beats in 1 minute, by the stroke volume, SV, the amount of blood ejected with each heartbeat. A typical resting heart rate is 75 beats per minute. The heart ejects about 70 milliliters each time it beats. That's its stroke volume, so just over 2 ounces. To determine cardiac output, multiply 75, that's the heart rate, times 70, the approximate volume in each beat. That equals 5,250 milliliters, or over 5 liters each minute. That is a typical cardiac output. Cardiac output increases with activity, but the average resting cardiac output is between 5 and 6 liters per minute. If an individual's heart has a greater stroke volume, such as the well-conditioned heart of an athlete, the heart would have to beat fewer times to maintain a cardiac output of 5 liters per minute. This explains why athletes tend to have slower pulse rates. Because cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume, the only 2 ways to affect cardiac output are to change the heart rate or to change the stroke volume. Keep in mind, though, that these 2 factors are interdependent. When heart rate increases, stroke volume decreases. And that's because the faster the heart rate, the less time the ventricles have to fill. Heart rate. A person's heart rate or pulse is the number of times the heart beats each minute. Newborn infants have heart rates of about 120 beats per minute. Young adult females tend to have heart rates of 72 to 80 beats per minute. Young adult males have heart rates of 64 to 72 beats per minute. A persistent pulse rate slower than 60 beats per minute is called bradycardia, although this commonly occurs during sleep or in athletes. A persistent resting heart rate greater than 100 beats per minute is called tachycardia. Fast fact: the body's total volume of blood is 4 to 6 liters. Since a normal cardiac output is 5 liters per minute, that means that the body's total volume of blood passes through the heart every single minute. That makes sense. To help clarify the variables affecting cardiac output, envision yourself pumping water out of an old-fashioned hand pump. The more times you pump, HR, the more water you'll produce, CO. Of course, the number of buckets you'll fill for every 100 pumps on the handle will vary depending on the amount of flow or volume, the volume of flow, SV. For example, if the water pressure is low and each pump produces a trickle, 100 pumps may barely fill a bucket. However, if the water flow is strong, 100 pumps may fill several buckets. Okay, so let's look at some of the factors affecting heart rate. Okay, so factors affecting heart rate. The heart generates and maintains its own beat. However, the nervous system, even though it doesn't initiate the heartbeat, can alter the heart's rhythm and force of contractions. Specifically, the medulla in the brain detects changes in the body and sends messages to the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, divisions of the autonomic nervous system, to raise or lower heart rate. Here's how it works. The medulla in the brain contains a cardiac center. In turn, the cardiac center contains an acceleratory center, and inhibitory center. The acceleratory center is affected by factors such as exercise and stress. They stimulate the acceleratory center. And factors such as a rise in blood pressure stimulate the inhibitory center. The acceleratory center sends out impulses via the sympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system sends impulses through cardiac nerves, which secrete norepinephrine to the SA node, the AV node, and the myocardium. This accelerates the heart rate and increases the forces of contractions. The inhibitory center sends signals via the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system sends signals via the vagus nerve, which secretes acetylcholine to the SA and AV nodes, which slows the heart rate. Input to the cardiac center. The cardiac center in the medulla receives input from multiple sources to initiate changes in heart rate. These receptors include the muscles, joints, arteries, and brainstem. For example, they show a picture, I guess is it not shown here on the slides? I don't see it. Okay, well, it's on page 287. They're showing a guy running, and there's sensory neurons in his calf and in his knee that are sending signals up the spinal cord to the medulla. So first, proprioceptors in the muscles and joints signal the cardiac center of changes in physical activity. This allows the heart to increase output even before the muscles demand more flow. Number two, baroreceptors or pressoreceptors. These are pressure sensors in the aorta and internal carotid arteries. Detect changes in blood pressure. If blood pressure falls, cardiac output drops. Therefore, the cardioacceleratory center will stimulate the heart to beat faster and maintain cardiac output. Vice versa, if blood pressure suddenly rises, impulses will be sent to slow the heart rate, decreasing cardiac output and lowering blood pressure. Number three, chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors found in the aortic arch, carotid arteries, and medulla detect increases in carbon dioxide, decreases in oxygen, and decreases in pH. In response, the sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate and stroke volume so as to circulate more oxygen. Note, a cluster of chemoreceptors near the fork of the carotid artery is called a carotid body. A similar cluster in the aorta is called an aortic body. Life lesson, emotions and heart rate. Emotions such as fear, pain, grief, and anger all affect heart rate. This occurs because two almond-shaped areas of the brain called amygdalae are key players in the formation and storage of memories associated with emotion. It's thought that stimulation of the amygdala, such as by emotion, causes it to send impulses to the autonomic nervous system. Anxiety, fear, and anger all cause the heart to beat faster. In contrast, grief slows the heart rate. It's also interesting that just the thought of doing something frightening, such as skydiving or taking a plunge off the high dive, can make your heart beat faster. Stroke volume. Stroke volume, the second factor affecting cardiac output, is never 100% of the volume in the ventricles. Typically, the ventricles eject 60 to 80% of their blood volume. This percentage is called the ejection fraction. An ejection fraction significantly lower than this indicates that the ventricle is weak and may be failing. Preload. Preload is the amount of tension or stretch in the ventricular muscle just before it contracts. The more blood entering the heart, the more the ventricle stretches. Example, think of shooting a rubber band. The tension or stretch placed on the rubber band before you shoot it is its preload. Contractility. Contractility is the force with which ventricular ejection occurs. The more the ventricle is stretched within limits, the more forcefully it will contract. This is known as Starling's law of the heart, which I underlined in my book. It's also in bold. So remember, Starling's law is the more that the ventricle is stretched within limits, the more forcefully it will contract. So the fuller it gets, it knows I'm gonna have to push harder to get this out of here. So that's Starling's law. Because the amount of blood in the ventricle at the end of the diastole determines how much the ventricle is stretched, the more blood returned to the heart each minute, the more forcefully it will contract. Too much blood, however, can overstretch the heart's muscle, causing it to lose elasticity. Example, the more you stretch a rubber band, the more it will contract when it's released, and the farther it will fly. Likewise, an old rubber band that's been overstretched isn't as elastic as a new one and won't fly as far when released. Afterload. The forces against the heart must work against. This is the afterload. So, such as the pressure of the blood in the arteries to eject its volume of blood is called the afterload. An increase in afterload, such as high blood pressure, opposes the ejection of blood from the ventricles, which decreases stroke volume. Example, if you try to shoot a rubber band underwater, the pressure of the water, the afterload, will resist the forward movement of the rubber band. That makes sense. Factors that affect contractility are called inotropic agents. Tip: to help remember this, think in as in inotropic agent affects the myocardium's ability to contract inward. Agents that increased contractility, positive inotropic agents, include excess calcium and epinephrine. Agents that decrease contractility or are negative inotropic agents include a calcium deficiency as well as potassium excess. Factors that influence heart rate are called chronotropic agents. Tip: the prefix chron refers to time, as in chronology. Therefore, chronotropic refers to how many times the heart beats within a certain time period. Agents that increase heart rate, positive chronotropic agents, include epinephrine and low levels of calcium. Agents that decrease heart rate, negative chronotropic agents, include acetylcholine and excess levels of potassium. Let's do this animation here.
The amount of blood ejected by the heart, called stroke volume, is affected by three factors: preload, contractility, and afterload. Preload is the amount of tension, or stretch in the ventricular muscle just before it contracts. The more blood entering the heart, the more the ventricle stretches. Contractility is the force with which ventricular ejection occurs. The more the ventricle is stretched within limits, the more forcefully it will contract. This is known as Starling's law of the heart. The amount of blood in the ventricle at the end of diastole determines how much the ventricle is stretched. The more blood returned to the heart each minute, the more forcefully it will contract. However, too much blood can overstretch the heart's muscle, causing it to lose elasticity. The forces the heart must work against to eject its volume of blood are called the afterload. Such forces include the pressure of the blood in the arteries. An increase in afterload, such as high blood pressure, opposes the ejection of blood from the ventricles, which decreases stroke volume.
Oh, I like the way they explained that and showed that. Okay. Question. Cardiac output equals the heart rate times stroke volume. That one sounds correct. B, stroke volume times ejection fraction. C, age times heart rate. I know that's not it. D, the percentage of blood ejected by the ventricles with each contraction. And that's the ejection fraction. So I know it's not D. The answer is A, because cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by the heart in 1 minute. This number is derived by multiplying the amount of blood ejected with each beat, the stroke volume, by the number of times the heart beats each minute. Life lesson, congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure results when either ventricle fails to pump blood effectively. This can occur because the ventricle is weakened from a myocardial infarction. Also, prolonged high blood pressure or incompetent heart valves, both of which force the heart to work harder, can weaken the ventricles. Chronic lung disease places a strain on the right ventricle because diseased lungs make it more difficult for the right ventricle to pump blood into pulmonary circulation. Over time, this can lead to failure of the right ventricle, called right-sided heart failure. Failure of the left ventricle is called left-sided heart failure. Symptoms of congestive heart failure vary according to the side of the heart affected. Keep in mind, however, that the failure of one ventricle places an added strain on the other ventricle, and eventually both ventricles fail. That sounds depressing. Actually, there are some things that they can do to help allow your heart to rest and heal. So there's like a left ventricular assist device that can be put in place via surgery to help give some people's heart an opportunity to rest and heal. Left ventricular failure. This is page 289. And it's important that we know what each of these conditions looks like. The left ventricular failure versus the right ventricular failure. So if the left ventricle fails, it falls behind in ejecting all of the blood it receives from the lungs to the rest of the body. So consequently, the blood backs up in the lungs, and this is going to cause shortness of breath and a buildup of fluid in the lungs, pulmonary edema. And the fluid is blood, okay, and it will cause coughing as well. Okay, right ventricular failure. If the right ventricle fails, it falls behind in ejecting all of the blood it receives from the systemic circulation. So blood backs up into the vena cava and throughout the peripheral vascular system. So this results in generalized swelling throughout the body, systemic edema, enlargement of the liver and spleen, pooling of fluid in the abdomen called ascites, distension of the jugular veins, and swelling of the ankles, feet, and fingers. Fast fact, adults with diabetes have a 2 to 8 times greater risk of developing heart failure, and that's partly because the disease process of diabetes damages the heart muscle. So we are at the end of this chapter, so I am going to end the recording. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that it has helped you.